In March 2017, during the renovation of what is now the Ashford Historical Society building in western Massachusetts, construction workers discovered something sealed behind a false wall in the basement. The space had been bricked over sometime in the late 1800s, hidden so deliberately that even the building's detailed architectural plans made no mention of it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them for nearly 150 years, were the private medical journals of Dr. Edmund Thatcher, physician to the town of Ashford from 1867 until his death in 1889. The journals documented routine cases, fevers, broken bones, childbirths, the everyday medical practice of a small New England town. But one leather-bound volume, separate from the others, had been wrapped 3 times and sealed with wax. Someone had wanted this particular record hidden. Dr. Sarah Kleinman, a medical historian from Boston University who was called in to authenticate the documents, remembers the moment she broke that seal. The room smelled of old leather and something else, the faint scent of lavender sachets someone had placed with the journals decades ago, long since turned to dust. The pages inside were covered in Dr. Thatcher's precise handwriting, but his entries here were different. His hand shook in places. Entire paragraphs had been crossed out, then rewritten. In the margins, single words appeared again and again. Impossible. Verified. How? The volume documented a case that Dr. Thatcher had investigated for 4 years, from 1871 until 1875. 2 girls, twin sisters, age 7 when the documented period began, who possessed an ability that Thatcher, a man of science and reason, could neither explain nor dismiss. The sisters could predict with documented 100% accuracy the exact final words that any person would speak before dying. Not approximate phrases, not general sentiments, the precise words in exact order, sometimes weeks or months before the person's death. Thatcher's journal contained over 30 documented predictions, each one accompanied by witness testimonies, signed affidavits, and follow-up investigations. Every single prediction had come true, every one. What made the case truly unprecedented, what had caused Dr. Thatcher to seal his research away, was documented in an entry dated October 14, 1874. The sisters had turned their gift on the doctor himself. This channel explores mysteries that science has tried and failed to explain. Cases that were hidden, suppressed, or deliberately destroyed because they challenged everything we thought we knew about human potential. Before we reveal what happened in Ashford, hit subscribe. We release one deep investigation every week, and we never run out of buried cases. Next week, we're releasing a case from Pennsylvania, 1867, involving 3 brothers who could feel each other's pain across hundreds of miles, documented by military physicians during the Civil War. That investigation is already complete. The only question is whether you'll be here to see it. Drop a comment. What state are you from? Because what happened in Massachusetts might be closer to your home than you think. Now let's go back to 1871, to the hills of western Massachusetts, where 2 7-year-old girls were about to shatter the boundaries of scientific understanding. Ashford, Massachusetts in 1871 was a mill town of approximately 400 souls, nestled in a valley where 3 rivers converged. The textile mills provided work, the Congregational Church provided moral structure, and everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. Dr. Edmund Thatcher arrived in Ashford in 1867, a young physician trained at Harvard Medical School. At 32, he had chosen rural practice over the prestige of Boston hospitals, drawn by a desire to serve communities that rarely saw qualified medical care. He kept meticulous records. His journals noted not just symptoms and treatments, but also the weather, the phases of the moon, anything that might correlate with illness or recovery. He was a man who believed that everything could be explained through careful observation and reason. This belief would be tested beyond anything he could have imagined. The town sat in the shadow of Mount Greylock, and in autumn, when fog rolled down from the peaks, Ashford could feel cut off from the world. The mills ran on schedule, children attended the schoolhouse, families filled the church pews on Sunday. But there was an undercurrent of tension in 1871, something Dr. Thatcher noted but couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the lingering trauma of the war, barely 6 years past. Perhaps it was the changing economy, the sense that the old ways were dying, or perhaps the town simply sensed what was coming. On November 3, 1871, everything changed. Margaret and Eleanor Pierce were born on a night that Dr. Thatcher would describe years later as unnatural in every particular. It was November 3, 1864. Their mother, Catherine Pierce, age 26, had gone into labor 3 weeks early. The birth should have been routine. Catherine was young, healthy, and this was her second pregnancy. Her first child, a son named Thomas, had been born without complication 2 years earlier. But nothing about this birth was routine. Dr. Thatcher arrived at the Pierce farmhouse at sunset to find the temperature in the bedroom had dropped so precipitously that he could see his breath. Outside, the November evening was cool but not cold. Inside Catherine's bedroom, frost formed on the inside of the windows. 3 candles placed around the room guttered and went out, one after another, though there was no wind. Catherine's husband, James Pierce, a level-headed farmer of 30 years, stood by the fireplace feeding wood into flames that gave off heat but somehow failed to warm the room. "I've never felt anything like it," Thatcher wrote in his journal. The cold seemed to emanate from Mrs. Pierce herself, as though something inside her was drawing all warmth from the air. Catherine was conscious, lucid, but in the grip of something Thatcher couldn't explain. Between contractions, she spoke in a voice he described as not quite her own, flatter, older, carrying no emotion whatsoever. She said things that made no sense. She recited a passage from a book she'd never read. She described in perfect detail the interior of a house in Boston she'd never visited. And then, as the contractions grew closer, she began to speak in phrases that Thatcher would later recognize as the final words of dying patients, people who were, at that moment, still alive. The twins were born at 11:47 p.m., 1 minute apart, Margaret first, then Eleanor. Both were silent. No crying, no sound at all. They simply opened their eyes and looked at the doctor with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life. Ancient, knowing, utterly calm. The moment Eleanor drew her first breath, the temperature in the room returned to normal. The candles, which had been dark, spontaneously reignited. Catherine Pierce closed her eyes and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Dr. Thatcher examined the infants, healthy, perfect, identical in every way except one. Margaret had a small birthmark on her left wrist, shaped like a crescent moon. Eleanor had no such mark. Otherwise, even their own mother would struggle to tell them apart. But it was their eyes that unsettled him. Pale gray, almost colorless, like ice on a clouded day. And they never seemed to blink at the same time. When Margaret's eyes closed, Eleanor's remained open. When Eleanor blinked, Margaret stared. It was as though they took turns watching the world. For the first 7 years of their lives, Margaret and Eleanor Pierce seemed like normal children. They played with their older brother Thomas. They helped their mother in the garden. They learned to read from their father, who taught from the family Bible each evening. But there were small things, strange things. They spoke to each other in a language no one else understood. Not nonsense words, but a fully formed language with grammar and syntax, complete sentences that meant nothing to anyone but them. Most twins develop their own communication style, what linguists call cryptophasia, but this was different. This was complete. When Dr. Thatcher later attempted to document their private language, he filled 17 pages with phonetic transcriptions and couldn't find a single pattern that matched any known language. They never played with other children, not because they were unkind or unfriendly. They simply showed no interest. At the schoolhouse, they sat together, always, and when the teacher called on one of them, both would answer in unison, saying exactly the same words. Their mother, Catherine, told Dr. Thatcher something in confidence when the girls were 5 years old. She came to his office on a Tuesday afternoon, and she looked exhausted, as though she hadn't slept in days. "They know things," she said quietly. "Things they shouldn't know. Things nobody should know." When Thatcher asked what she meant, Catherine shook her head. "It's nothing," she said. "Just watch them, doctor. If something happens, I want someone to understand." 2 years later, something happened. On March 12, 1871, 7-year-old Margaret and Eleanor Pierce approached Mrs. Abigail Hartwell after church services. Mrs. Hartwell was 63 years old, the school teacher, beloved by everyone in Ashford. She was healthy, active, sharp-minded. Margaret and Eleanor stood in front of her in their matching Sunday dresses, their pale eyes fixed on her face. And then, in perfect unison, they spoke. "You will say, 'Tell my sister I forgive her.'" Mrs. Hartwell smiled, confused. "What's that, dears?" Eleanor spoke alone this time, her voice flat and certain. "Those will be your last words. You will say, 'Tell my sister I forgive her.' You have 14 days." The church went silent. Conversation stopped. Everyone had heard. Mrs. Hartwell's face went white. She had been estranged from her sister for 20 years, following a bitter inheritance dispute. No one in Ashford knew the details. It was old business, from before Mrs. Hartwell had moved to the town. She'd never spoken of it publicly. James Pierce grabbed his daughters by their hands and pulled them away, apologizing profusely. Catherine Pierce looked like she might faint. But the twins' expressions never changed. They looked at Mrs. Hartwell with something that might have been compassion or might have been simple observation. It was impossible to tell. Dr. Thatcher, who had been present for the exchange, wrote in his journal that night, "The girls spoke with absolute certainty, not prediction, not hope or fear. They stated a fact, as one might state that the sun rises in the east. I confess, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room." 14 days later, on March 26, 1871, Abigail Hartwell was found in her home, dead of a sudden heart failure. She had been grading papers at her desk when it happened. The doctor who attended her death, Dr. Thatcher himself, arrived to find her neighbor, Mrs. Elizabeth Connolly, kneeling beside the body, tears streaming down her face. "She was conscious when I got here," Mrs. Connolly said. "Just for a moment. She looked at me and grabbed my hand, and she said," Mrs. Connolly's voice broke. She said, "Tell my sister I forgive her." And then she was gone. Dr. Thatcher stood in that small parlor, looking at Abigail Hartwell's peaceful face, and felt the world shift beneath his feet. He took out his notebook and wrote down everything, his hand shaking so badly he could barely form the letters. The Pierce twins had predicted the exact final words, not the general sentiment, not an approximation, the exact phrase, word for word, and they had known 14 days in advance.
But we need to pause here, because what happened next, the escalation, the tests, the terror,
won't make sense unless you understand what Dr. Thatcher was about to discover. This wasn't about two girls making lucky guesses. This was about something that violated every principle of the natural world as he understood it. And the evidence, documented over the next 4 years, would force him to a conclusion he could barely write down, even in his private journal. The Pierce twins weren't predicting death. They were hearing it, as though death itself whispered to them in advance. Let's go back to April 1871, 1 week after Abigail Hartwell's funeral, when Dr. Thatcher made a decision that would consume the rest of his life. Dr. Edmund Thatcher went to the Pierce farm on April 4, 1871. He found James Pierce in the barn repairing a plow blade. The man looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. "I need to examine your daughters," Thatcher said, "with your permission." James Pierce set down his hammer. "You think they're sick?" "I think they have an ability that needs to be documented." "Documented?" James Pierce laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Half the town thinks they're cursed. The other half thinks we're cursed for raising them. The pastor suggested we send them away to an institution." "They're not insane," Thatcher said firmly. "Whatever this is, it's not madness." James Pierce looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, doctor, but I'm warning you. Once you start looking into this, you won't be able to stop. It gets into your mind, the knowing, the waiting." Dr. Thatcher began a series of examinations in May 1871. He measured the girls' vital signs, tested their reflexes, examined their eyes, ears, and throats. He found nothing unusual. Their hearts beat at normal rates. Their pupils responded to light. They were healthy 7-year-old girls in every measurable way, except for one thing. When he asked them about Abigail Hartwell, about how they had known her final words, they both looked at him with those pale, calm eyes, and Margaret spoke. "We heard them." "Heard them? How?" "The way you hear anything. They were spoken." "But Mrs. Hartwell hadn't spoken them yet." Eleanor shook her head slowly, as though explaining something obvious to a child. "She had already said them. We heard her say them. It's just that you hadn't heard it yet." Thatcher pressed them. Were they speaking metaphorically? Did they see visions? Did they dream these words? "No dreams," Margaret said. "We just hear, like someone calling from the next room. The words come to us, and we know they're the last words. We always know." "How many? How many people's last words do you hear?" The twins looked at each other. Some silent communication passed between them. Then Eleanor said, very quietly, "Everyone's. Everyone we meet. Everyone we see. We hear all the last words." Dr. Thatcher felt his mouth go dry. "Everyone?" "Yours too," Margaret said, and smiled. It was not a cruel smile. It was almost kind, almost pitying. "But we won't tell you. Not yet." On June 7th, 1871, Margaret and Eleanor Pierce were in Ashford's general store with their mother when James Harrington walked in. Harrington was 42 years old, a businessman who owned the Sawmill on the northern edge of town. He was robust, loud, confident, the kind of man who filled a room with his presence. The twins stopped what they were doing and stared at him. Harrington noticed. He walked over, grinning. "Well, hello there, little ladies. You're the Pierce girls, aren't you? I heard you made quite a prediction about old Mrs. Hartwell." His tone was mocking, jovial. He didn't believe a word of it. Margaret tilted her head, studying him. "You will say, 'I should have listened to my brother.'" Harrington's grin faltered. "What's that?" Eleanor continued, her voice a perfect echo of her sister's. "You will say, 'I should have listened to my brother.' In 6 weeks, on July 19th. "That's not funny," Harrington said, his face darkening. "You tell your girls to keep their mouths shut, Mrs. Pierce." But the twins weren't finished. Margaret added, very calmly, "You'll say it in the sawmill at sunset. You'll be alone, and you'll say it 3 times, getting quieter each time until you can't speak anymore." James Harrington turned and walked out of the store without buying anything. The entire exchange had lasted less than a minute, but everyone present would remember it with perfect clarity. Dr. Thatcher heard about the incident that evening and immediately went to interview the twins. He documented their statement word for word and had their mother sign it as a witness. Then he did something unusual. He went to see James Harrington's brother Samuel, who lived in Springfield, 30 miles away. Samuel Harrington was everything his brother was not: quiet, cautious, detail-oriented. He worked as an accountant. When Dr. Thatcher asked if James had ever ignored his advice, Samuel laughed bitterly. "Every time I open my mouth," Samuel said, "James thinks I'm too timid, too worried. We had a big fight 3 years ago. I told him the sawmill machinery was dangerous, told him to invest in safety improvements. He called me an old woman and hasn't taken my advice since." Dr. Thatcher documented this conversation and sealed it in an envelope marked with the date. 6 weeks passed. James Harrington went about his business, laughing off the prediction whenever anyone mentioned it. He made a point of being surrounded by people, as though crowds could ward off whatever the twins had foreseen. July 19, 1871 was a Wednesday. The weather was clear, the temperature warm. Harrington had been at his sawmill all day, overseeing a large order. His workers left at sunset, as was customary. Harrington stayed behind to inspect a new saw blade that had arrived that afternoon. At 8:47 p.m., according to later testimony, a local farmer named Robert Walsh passed by the sawmill on his way home. He heard the machinery running, which was unusual at that hour. Then he heard shouting, a man's voice, panicked. Walsh ran to the mill and found the door blocked from inside. He forced it open and saw James Harrington trapped beneath a fallen beam. The new saw blade had been improperly balanced, and when Harrington had tested it, the entire mounting had given way, bringing down part of the ceiling structure. Harrington was conscious but badly injured. Blood pooled around him. Walsh knelt beside him, trying to lift the beam, but it was impossible alone. "Get help!" Walsh shouted. But Harrington grabbed his arm. His eyes were wide, filled with something beyond pain, a kind of terrible understanding, and he spoke, his voice rough but clear. "I should have listened to my brother." Walsh paused, staring at him. "What?" Harrington continued, her voice a perfect echo of her sister's. "I should have listened to my brother." Walsh said, "Hold on, I'm getting help." But Harrington's grip tightened. He pulled Walsh closer and whispered, barely audible now, "I should have listened to my brother." And then he was silent. His hand fell away. Robert Walsh would later testify that the exact words, spoken 3 times with diminishing volume, matched what the Pierce twins had predicted 6 weeks earlier, down to the number of repetitions, down to the setting sun visible through the sawmill windows, down to the absolute solitude. Walsh hadn't arrived until after the final words were spoken. Dr. Thatcher's investigation of Harrington's death filled 23 pages of his journal. He interviewed Walsh a dozen times, always getting the same testimony. He examined the sawmill and found that the collapse had resulted from mechanical failure, not sabotage. He documented that Harrington had been alone when the accident occurred, with no possible way for the twins to have caused or predicted the specific circumstances, except through the impossible. They simply knew. The envelope containing Samuel Harrington's testimony about his brother ignoring his advice was opened publicly in front of witnesses, its seal intact. Everything matched. And now the town of Ashford was truly frightened. The medical records describe what happened next in clinical terms. Dr. Thatcher's official notes speak of continued observation and additional documented cases, but the doctor's private writings tell a different story. "I am losing my faith in the natural world," he wrote on August 3, 1871. "Each morning I wake hoping yesterday was a dream. Each evening I review my notes and find the same impossible truth staring back at me. These children have torn a hole in reality, and I cannot look away. I cannot stop documenting, and I am beginning to fear what they might tell me about myself." That fear, that very personal dread, would come to pass 3 years later, but first, the twins' abilities would be tested in the most public, most devastating way possible. By October 1871, Dr. Thatcher had documented 14 predictions from the Pierce twins, 14 deaths, 14 sets of final words, all matching exactly. The accuracy rate remained 100%. But something was changing. The predictions were coming more frequently, and the twins themselves seemed to be suffering. Margaret developed nosebleeds that would start without warning. Eleanor complained of headaches that left her unable to stand. Their mother told Dr. Thatcher that both girls had stopped sleeping properly. They would lie awake all night, staring at the ceiling, whispering to each other in their private language. "It's getting louder," Eleanor told the doctor during an examination in late October. "All the last words. They used to come one at a time, but now they come all together, like a crowd all shouting at once." "How many voices do you hear right now?" Thatcher asked. Margaret and Eleanor looked at each other, then in unison, 73. Dr. Thatcher felt ice form in his stomach. 73 people? 73 people in Ashford will die in the next year, Margaret said. "We hear all their last words. Sometimes we can tell who they belong to. Sometimes we can't." "Can you tell me any of them?" The twins were silent for a long moment. Then Margaret spoke, her voice taking on that flat, strange quality. "Help." Eleanor continued. The word help, said 27 times by 11 different people, all at the same time, all in the same place. "When?" Thatcher demanded. "Soon," Margaret said. "Very soon." On November 16, 1871, the Pierce twins approached their father in the barn. They stood in front of him, holding hands, and spoke in perfect unison. "The mill will burn. 11 people will die. It will happen at night. They will all say, 'Help,' as they die, and no one will come in time. You have to make them listen." James Pierce went to the mill owner immediately. He went to the town council. He went to the fire brigade. He begged them to take precautions, to station night watchmen, to check the equipment and the oil lamps and the wood-burning stoves. They dismissed him, called his daughters disturbed, suggested again that the twins needed institutional care, not indulgence. Dr. Thatcher tried as well. He presented his documentation, his witness testimonies, his sealed envelopes of predictions that had come true. The town council listened politely and did nothing. "We can't shut down the mill based on the visions of 2 children, they said. "The economy of this town depends on that mill." 3 nights later, on November 19, 1871, at 2:17 a.m., the Ashford mill caught fire. The blaze started in the lower storage area where bales of cotton were kept. The night watchman, a man named Peter Drummond, discovered it too late. The flames had already spread to the wooden stairs, cutting off the only exit. 11 workers had been sleeping in the upstairs dormitory, a common practice among the mill's overnight crew. The town woke to the sound of the fire bell and the smell of smoke. By the time the volunteer brigade arrived, the mill was fully engulfed. Through the upper windows, witnesses could see figures moving, hear voices screaming. Robert Walsh, the same farmer who had found James Harrington dying, stood in the crowd and later testified to what he heard. The word "help" shouted over and over from multiple voices, sometimes in unison, sometimes overlapping. He counted 27 times. Then silence. All 11 workers perished. The mill burned to its foundation. The investigation later determined that an overturned lamp had been the cause, accidental, unavoidable. Except that 2 7-year-old girls had warned the town 3 days in advance. At the mass funeral on November 23, 1871, Margaret and Eleanor Pierce stood with their family in the back of the church. They did not cry. They did not speak. They simply watched as 11 coffins were blessed and carried to the cemetery. Dr. Thatcher stood near them and wrote in his journal later, "The twins' faces showed no emotion, but I saw Margaret's nose bleeding again and Eleanor's hands trembling. I asked them quietly if they were in pain. Eleanor looked at me and said, 'We heard them die, all of them. We heard it before it happened, and we heard it while it was happening, and we still hear it now. The last words never stop. They just keep echoing.'" That night, half the town turned against the Pierce family. The other half began to treat the twins like prophets. Neither response was healthy. Neither was safe. Dr. Edmund Thatcher continued his investigations through 1872 and 1873, documenting another 16 predictions, all of which came true. But he knew something was coming. The twins had told him years earlier that they heard his last words too. On October 14, 1874, Dr. Thatcher was examining Eleanor Pierce. Margaret was ill that day with a fever and had stayed home. He was taking her pulse, noting the continuing abnormalities in her vital signs, when Eleanor suddenly grabbed his wrist. Her pale gray eyes locked onto his. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper. "You will say, I should have sealed this journal sooner." Dr. Thatcher felt his heart stop. When? 15 years, June 3rd, 1889. You'll be in your study. You'll be alone. You'll be reading this journal, the one you're writing now, and those will be your last words. The room seemed to tilt. Thatcher pulled his hand away, but Eleanor held firm. "You'll die of heart failure," she continued, and now there were tears in her eyes, the first emotion he'd ever seen her display. "You'll have time to hide the journal. You'll seal it in the wall, because you'll know that no one is ready to read it yet. And your last thought will be that you should have hidden it sooner, before you wrote so much, before you documented everything. And you'll say the words out loud to the empty room, 'I should have sealed this journal sooner.'" "Why are you telling me this?" Thatcher's voice shook. "Because you've been kind to us," Eleanor said simply. "Because you tried to help. Because you deserve to know." Dr. Thatcher left the Pierce farm that day and went home to his study. He sat at his desk for 3 hours, staring at his journals, years of documentation, witness testimonies, evidence of the impossible. And he realized Eleanor was right. The world wasn't ready. Perhaps it would never be ready. But he couldn't stop writing. He had to document everything, even knowing that one day he would hide it all away. He wrote one final entry that night. "If you are reading this, I am dead. I died on June 3rd, 1889, saying the words Eleanor Pierce told me I would say 15 years before I said them.
Everything in these journals is true. Everything has been verified. And I have sealed this record because I am a coward, because I know what this evidence means, and I cannot bear the world knowing it before I am gone. May God forgive me, and may God help the Pierce twins wherever they are."
Think about that for a moment. Dr. Edmund Thatcher spent 15 years knowing the exact words he would speak as he died. 15 years knowing the precise date. 15 years unable to prevent it, unable to change it, because the Pierce twins had never been wrong. Not once, not ever. Would you want to know? Would you want to carry that knowledge for 15 years? And here's the question that haunted Thatcher until his death. If the twins knew everyone's last words, did that mean those words were already determined? Did it mean that free will was an illusion, that the future was already written, that every word we would ever speak, including our last, was fixed and unchangeable? The doctor never found an answer, but the twins, in their own way, did.
By 1875, life had become unbearable for the Pierce family. James Pierce's farm was vandalized. Rocks were thrown through their windows. The pastor publicly declared that the twins were in league with dark forces and called for their removal from the community. Margaret and Eleanor, now 11 years old, had stopped speaking to anyone outside their family. They spoke only to each other in their private language and spent their days in the farmhouse, hiding from the world that feared them. Catherine Pierce, aged 20 years in 4. Her hair went white. She developed a tremor in her hands that never stopped. On April 22, 1875, Dr. Thatcher went to the Pierce farm for what would be his final examination of the twins. He found the house empty, completely empty, furniture still in place, dishes on the table as though the family had simply stood up mid-meal and walked away. But the Pierces were gone. The farm stood vacant. No neighbors had seen them leave. No one had heard anything. They had vanished in the middle of the night, taking nothing with them except the clothes on their backs. Dr. Thatcher launched an investigation that lasted 6 months. He sent inquiries to neighboring towns, to cities across Massachusetts, to ports in Boston and New York. Nothing. The Pierce family, James, Catherine, Thomas, Margaret, and Eleanor, had disappeared as completely as if they had never existed. Except for one thing. In the barn, carved into a wooden beam, someone had left a message in that strange language the twins used to speak to each other. Dr. Thatcher copied it carefully, but could never translate it. Years later, a linguist would examine his transcription and declare it possibly a constructed language with no root in any known linguistic family. But below the untranslatable words, carved in plain English, was a single sentence. The last words never stop. We had to go where they couldn't find us. Rumors persisted for decades. A family matching the Pierces' description was supposedly seen in Canada in 1877. A woman resembling Catherine Pierce was allegedly living in a religious community in Vermont in 1882. 2 identical twin girls with pale gray eyes were reported in a traveling circus in 1890, billed as the Prophetic Sisters, though no names were ever recorded. Dr. Thatcher never saw them again.
When Dr. Sarah Kleinman opened Edmund Thatcher's sealed journal in 2017, she expected a historical curiosity, perhaps some interesting medical observations from the 1800s. What she found changed the trajectory of her career. The documentation was extraordinary, Kleinman told reporters in 2018. Thatcher wasn't a credulous man. He was a Harvard-trained physician, skeptical by nature. And yet here were pages and pages of witness testimonies, signed affidavits, investigations. 33 documented predictions, every single one verified. Kleinman spent 2 years verifying what she could. Death records from Ashford matched Thatcher's journal entries. Newspaper accounts from 1871 confirmed the mill fire and the deaths of 11 workers. Census records showed the Pierce family living in Ashford from 1864 to 1875, then vanishing from all records after 1875. And on June 3, 1889, Edmund Thatcher died in his study at age 54. The death certificate listed the cause as heart failure. His housekeeper found him slumped over his desk, his hand still holding a pen, a single leather journal open in front of him. According to the housekeeper's testimony to the coroner, Dr. Thatcher's final words, spoken to the empty room just before he collapsed, were, "I should have sealed this journal sooner," exactly as Eleanor Pierce had predicted 15 years earlier. Modern researchers have attempted to find descendants of the Pierce family. Genealogical searches have turned up nothing conclusive. If Margaret and Eleanor had children, those children left no paper trail. If they survived to old age, they did so under assumed names. In 2019, a Harvard Medical School team published a paper examining historical cases of precognition and anomalous perception. Thatcher's documentation of the Pierce twins was cited as one of the most thoroughly documented cases in 19th century medical literature, with a level of verification uncommon for the period. The paper concluded, while modern science has no framework for explaining the abilities described, the historical evidence meets rigorous standards for authenticity. We are left with a case that is both well documented and scientifically inexplicable. Current theories range from quantum consciousness to genetic anomalies affecting temporal perception. None are conclusive. None explain how two girls could predict with 100% accuracy the final words of 33 dying people. The Pierce twins remain missing, and their abilities remain unexplained. 33 predictions, 33 sets of final words, 100% accuracy. The evidence is documented. The witnesses are named. The investigation was conducted by a Harvard-trained physician who had every reason to be skeptical and every opportunity to expose fraud. The evidence says the Pierce twins could hear death speaking before it happened. Science says that's impossible. Both cannot be true, yet both are documented. If two 11-year-old girls approached you tomorrow and told you the exact words you would speak before you died, would you believe them? Would you want to know? If this case fascinates you, subscribe. Next week, we're investigating three brothers from Pennsylvania, 1867, who could feel each other's pain across hundreds of miles, documented by military physicians during the Civil War. Hit the notification bell. Some mysteries refuse simple answers. Dr. Thatcher chose to hide his journal for 128 years. Now it's open. Now we know what he found. And now you know what Eleanor Pierce told him 15 years before he died. He should have sealed it sooner.